community absolutely terrified and up in arms. So what John talked about earlier about the flyers around town, I mean, this was the mid-'80s, bedroom community, suburban Long Island. The young woman who was killed in the case that John was falsely convicted in, her name was Teresa Fusco, was actually one of 3 young women that went missing around that time. And the other 2, to this day, those crimes have never been solved.
Wow.
And for all we know, it may have been the same killer or killers in those cases. But by the time Teresa disappeared, she was missing for, what was it, John, 3 weeks? About 3 weeks before her body was found. So the terror and the paranoia that they're feeling in this town is only heightening. And the parents, the elected officials, the teachers are saying, solve this crime, solve this crime. And after she was found, naked, brutalized, in the woods, just a horrible way to go, the police spent months basically bringing in every working class guy between the ages of 18 and 29 in town in and working them over, trying to see if they could find a weak spot until they get poor John Kogut, who had a really rough life, grown up in foster care, nobody to fight for him. And even he held out for hours and hours till he finally confessed, and gave a false confession that, as John said, was a classic false confession in that it had no information that the police didn't already know, so he couldn't point them to clothing or jewelry or fruits of the crime or anything about her that wasn't part of the police's knowledge, but everything they did know almost too perfectly. But when it came to the hairs, part of what was wrong with this case when they decided they were going to pin it on John and his 2 friends is that they had no physical evidence. There was no evidence against them, no DNA, no blood typing, nothing of hers that was ever found with them, no eyewitnesses, as far as anybody knew at the time, who had seen what vehicle she'd gotten into and she was leaving her job at a roller skating rink. And, we don't say lightly that police frame people. I mean, a lot of times police will make bad mistakes. They will cut corners. They will interview witnesses in a way that's not ethical or permissible. But in this case, there is actual scientific evidence that John and his co-defendants got framed. Namely, Detective Volpe, the lead homicide detective, claimed that he found several hairs when he finally got a search warrant for John's van, the one he used for his moving jobs. He claimed that he found several hairs that were long hairs, looked just like Teresa's, and microscopically appeared to be the same as Teresa's hairs. We later did DNA and confirmed that they were, in fact, her hairs. So that would be pretty bad evidence, and normally you'd think, well, that makes John guilty. The problem was those hairs would have had to be deposited in the van during this period when John and his friends were alleged to have abducted her for just a few minutes. According to the confession, they had given her a ride and then raped her, and she was in the van for not longer, certainly no more than an hour. And then she was missing for several weeks. But the hairs came from a corpse. They had this decomposition at the roots of the hairs called postmortem root banding, which basically happens when hairs are attached to a corpse that's decomposing. And so Detective Volpe takes these hairs, and whether he planted them in the van or just put them in an envelope marked hairs from van that was back at the lab, we don't know. It doesn't really matter. But he lied under oath and said that these hairs came from the van, and it's physically impossible because she had been decomposing for several weeks when these hairs were collected. They were from her autopsy, not from the van.
I do believe that most people that are doing those jobs are doing the best they can, and we need police to keep us safe. But when you get somebody like this Volpe character who does the type of damage that he did, they have to be held to account.
Yeah.
I mean, these detectives actually created a fictitious scenario after they actually botched what we think was the actual crime scene. And unbeknownst to us, the night she disappeared, a car within approximately a mile of where she was last seen was stolen. And when this car was recovered approximately a week later, they found a pair of blue striped jeans with one of the legs inside out in the back, but stuffed underneath the seat. And on the missing persons report, when she was last seen, that's what she was wearing, blue striped jeans. So the homicide cops grabbed this car, right, which was already cleaned by the owner, and the blue striped jeans were thrown out by the Limerick Police Department. So there was police reports regarding the stolen car and the blue striped jeans, right? And then there was a piece of rope missing from the car, and according to the ME, right, there was a piece of rope similar used as, what would you say, the murder weapon?
Yeah.
right? And this was missing from the car. When they brought the owner back to the area where the car was recovered, they found the piece of rope, but they took a picture of the piece of rope. And one would think that, given the significance of that, this piece of rope would be taken into evidence and vouched, and the police say it never was. So this is information that should have been turned over to the defense, and it never was. And we never found out about this information till we were in the civil litigation stage.
20-something years later.
Correct.
I was John's Innocence Project lawyer. We didn't know about this information. You know, a lot of times, as you know and a lot of your guests have talked about, there's evidence pointing to someone's innocence. And, you know, certainly in this case, this is evidence about where the crime occurred and what type of vehicle was used, which is a huge objective lead that's different than the entire case that was against John and his co-defendants. But that is evidence. Often we learn about that when we're in post-conviction, meaning the person's been convicted and we're litigating their appeals and we're trying to exonerate them. In John's case, as he'll tell you, we cleared him with DNA and other evidence that we gathered as part of the Innocence Project and Centurion Ministries investigation of the case. But we didn't even know about this other evidence the police had of his innocence until after he was exonerated. It only came out when he had lawyers representing him in his lawsuit against the police department and the county that this all came to light. So it's a really stunning fact that you can have evidence of innocence that's hidden possibly even from the DAs because it was in the police file and only come out after someone's exonerated. And so his case is a DNA exoneration case, but as with so many, there's other evidence that could have cleared him even before he went to trial.
Every year in the U.S., there are thousands and thousands of wrongful convictions. For Life, the podcast, is a 6-part series exploring true stories of people who were wrongfully convicted but held on to hope. The podcast from Sony Pictures TV and ABC TV is in collaboration with the new scripted drama series For Life, produced by Curtis 50 Cent Jackson and inspired by the life of the show's host, Isaac Wright Jr. Like Wright's story, For Life, the podcast explores other true stories of injustice, tests of character, love and faith, and triumphs of spirit. Debuting February 11th, wherever you listen to podcasts. Want to hear a modern solution for a modern-day problem? BetterHelp Online Counseling is there to help you with anything that interferes with your happiness or prevents you from achieving your goals. BetterHelp offers licensed professional counselors who are specialists in issues like depression, stress, anxiety, sleep issues, family conflicts, and so much more. Connect with your professional counselor in a safe and private online environment. And remember, everything you share is confidential and it's so convenient. You can get help now on your own time at your own pace. You can schedule secure video or phone sessions, plus chat and text with your therapist. And if you're not happy with your counselor, you can request a new one at any time at no additional charge. Best of all, it's a truly affordable option. And for Wrongful Conviction listeners, you get 10% off your first month with the discount code WRONGFUL. So why not get started today? Go to BetterHelp.com/wrongful. Simply fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs. Get matched with a counselor you'll love. BetterHelp.com/wrongful. Tell them I sent you. As the son of a police officer, this must have been totally surreal to you because as much as we all grew up, I mean, when I was a son, I had, ideas that I would become a policeman, right? I mean, we all look up to firemen and cops. I think most boys do, right, especially growing up, right? In the era that we grew up in. But for you, it was a very personal thing, right? You must have been very proud to have a dad who's a cop, I would think, right?
Right.
I mean, I would be. But then at the same time, I would expect that you must have thought that because of the fact that your dad was in blue, that this wouldn't happen to you, right? And was your dad around? Was he alive at this time?
No, my father passed away in January of '84, so he wasn't around. But my father said something to me at one time while he was on the job, and he told me, if you ever have a problem with a cop, call a lawyer. And when the police brought me in and interrogated me for 20 plus hours, once I was released, I immediately called a lawyer.
Why didn't you call a lawyer at first?
They wouldn't let me leave. They took my car keys. I mean, they wouldn't let me call a lawyer. I was there. I mean, they weren't letting me go anywhere. And finally, they let me go. And after 20 hours, I was so out of it, they wouldn't even let me drive home. They drove me home and drove my car home.
There's so many things wrong with this that I'm just like...
No, this is a complicated case. There's no doubt about it. And I'm just glad it's over with. But what the cops did to me, right, it's unfortunate that they can do to whoever they please. I mean, they could pick somebody out of a group, right, and make them a target, and then they fabricate a case around them, and that's exactly what they did to us. Because from day one, I requested DNA testing, and back in the 80s, mid-80s, there was no DNA testing. And back in 93, 94, 95, we had 3 different DNA tests done. One was inconclusive. The 2 other ones excluded us. And back in 95, I thought we were going to get cut loose. I thought that was going to be the end of the gospel. That wasn't the case. The judge
John should have been one of the first DNA galleries in the country because he was going in pro se, and he had a lawyer who was helping him out for some of that time, early on, and he's incredibly smart, and he was researching and filing his own motions. He had a DNA test from sperm from a 16-year-old girl who was a virgin that didn't come back to him or Dennis or John Kogut. And the DA said, doesn't matter. Could have been a 4th guy, right? 4th guy. There's no 3rd guy. There's no 2nd guy. There was 1 guy. It was his sperm, and it wasn't any of these guys. And he goes to court, and the judges back then weren't as educated as they are now about DNA and what it shows. And, he had different lawyers, and they said, sorry, not giving you a new trial. And so there he was, in the mid-90s, starting at square one again.
Let's just reflect on that for a second, too. So you proved with DNA that you were innocent, and they're like, yeah, that's all right, doesn't matter. I think probably everyone at home is experiencing the same, or in your car or wherever you're listening, the same thing that I'm experiencing, which is that, wait a minute, that sounds like a misprint or a misstatement. That can't really be true.
The prosecutors actually lied in their papers about the reliability of the tests. They insinuated that the test results were not reliable, which is ludicrous because there's 2 independent tests done by 2 independent labs, and they identify the same exact DNA profile. So if one lab made a mistake, how could the other lab, independent lab, make the same mistake and identify the exact same DNA profile? So when they argued in their papers that the tests weren't reliable, I mean, that was totally ludicrous, and the judge adopted all of this insanity.
And then, if I remember correctly, after they realized they weren't getting anywhere for a while, the judge was getting skeptical of the reliability argument. Then they said, well, the only thing that was tested for this last round was off of a vaginal slide, which is a glass slide that the medical examiner at autopsy makes from the cotton swab that was actually had most of the sperm and the semen on it. And it was just the one part of the slide. So maybe these 3 guys who we convicted, maybe their DNA was on the rest of the slide or on the swabs, and we just don't have enough material. So you had to believe 2 things. One, that the test was missing all of their DNA, but also that they had some crime partner, this mystery John Doe, who was the 4th guy whose name didn't come up in the confession, didn't come up from any of the informants, didn't come up from any of the witnesses, who everybody had been covering up for this last 10 years, which was absurd. But the courts bought it. And so then they basically gave John a challenge, which was, prove us wrong. Prove to us that your DNA is not really there. And then we did that.
Right. In 2001, there was a small portion of sample left, and they retested it using new methodology where they would be able to run that result through the federal and state databases, through CODIS, right? And again, when they tested that, it comes back matching the same DNA profile that came back in the 90s.
Amazing. A miracle.
And they ran it through CODIS hoping that they would get a hit, right? And since they didn't get a hit, they're still maintaining that it's not reliable. Then in 2002, I met Nina Morrison. And IP took on more involvement in the case, right, and got us all independent lawyers, right? They got lawyers for Dennis, they got lawyers for John, And in early 2003, Nina and a couple of the lawyers went to inventory evidence